If you didn't build domino chains while you were bored out of your mind in public school after standardized testing or whatever, then I don't know what you were doing with your time. Okay, so this was a chain of dominoes that I built. It took me all of about 2 minutes. And, you know, you could build them far more complex than this and cooler and to say words and stuff. I don't know. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. I built a simple one. It obviously functions by each domino hitting the next and knocking it down. That domino then goes to knock down the next domino, which again just does the same thing over and over again until it ends. So what you have is a causal chain of dominoes. One domino is falling, causes the next domino to fall, which causes the next domino to fall, etc. But you might think, and this is maybe seems like a crazy question, how did it all start? Now, what seems like the obvious answer to that is, well, you know, Justin, obviously you started it, right? We saw you do it. But it seems like that would have to be true for any chain of dominoes falling. It's not like you can just have dominoes falling forever, going backwards in time. So that's what we're talking about today, is what's going to be called the causal or the first cause argument for God's existence. And it depends, crucially, on these sorts of things, causal chains and their beginnings. And the claim is very simple. It's that there are obviously causal chains in the world. That's what sort of physical reality is mostly made up of. Causes causing things, some things causing other things, which go on to cause other things, which go on to cause other things. And the very simple insight that proponents of the first cause argument have is that those causal chains have to have had a beginning. And so that means there has to have been a first cause. That first cause would have to have certain properties. It couldn't be a normal cause, because a normal cause in a normal causal chain, like one of these dominoes falling, that's a normal cause. It causes another domino to fall. But what's kind of a feature of a normal cause like that is that something has to have caused it, right? A normal cause has to have been caused by something else. And so once we've established that there has to be a first cause, we can ask, what does that first cause have to be like that it could itself be uncaused? And long story short, people will say, well, it would basically have to be God, right? It would have to be self-sufficient. It would have to be somehow supreme in terms of power and goodness to be able to cause other things without itself being caused. But in order, you might think, in order for a cause to be uncaused itself, but causing other things, it would have to be a necessary being, a being that could not have failed to exist. But then you could go on to say, well, any cause in the universe, anything that's happening within the universe, could have easily failed to happen, or could have failed to happen. I don't know about easily, right? And so it would have to be a cause, this first cause would have to be something outside of the universe. And proponents of this argument will say, well, okay, then a very good candidate for that is God, right? It has to be something outside of the universe, and so sort of supernatural, outside of the natural world, outside of the natural order. It would have to be something like God. It would have to be a supernatural being. Anyway, you're going to have similar objections to this sort of argument. People who say, even if I grant your conclusion that there has to be a first cause, it doesn't entail that God exists, because the first cause doesn't have to be God, right? It could just be some pretty powerful being that maybe has gone out of existence. Maybe it's an alien. Well, I guess it wouldn't be an alien, because we're talking about the existence of the universe and physical beings within the universe. So it couldn't actually, you might actually get more out of this conclusion than you do out of the conclusion to the design argument. Remember, the conclusion of the design argument just established that there has to be an intelligent designer. It didn't establish that it would have to be a non-physical designer outside of the physical universe, at least in its initial form. In its initial form, it was about the apparent design in biological organisms. But this, of course, the final form, what I argued was the much better form of the design argument, did entail that the designer would have to be someone outside or something outside of the universe. But here, the first cause argument, even in this initial form, entails that yes, the first cause would have to be something outside of the physical universe. Now, of course, that doesn't have to be God. It doesn't have to be all powerful or all knowing or all good. It has to be pretty dang powerful and pretty, I would assume, pretty knowledgeable. But it doesn't necessarily follow that it has to be a person, I don't think. But I feel like these objections, like the way I feel about the same objections to the design argument, which is it's sort of splitting hairs, right? If you conclude that there's a first cause that exists supernaturally outside of the natural order, and it's really powerful, whatever it is, and it brought the universe into being, you're a good part of the way to establishing that God exists. And maybe we need more argument to establish that there's only one God, that he's actually personal, that he's all powerful, that he's all knowing, that he's all good. But you've done a lot of the work, right? We don't have to do all the work at once, right? When you renovate your house, you do one project at a time, right? You don't have to prove that God exists in one step. But you've made a big step towards proving that God exists if you prove that there is some very powerful being outside of the natural order and outside of the universe that caused the universe to come into being. And that's what the first cause argument purports to do. Now, let's slow down just a little bit. I'll talk for just maybe 5-6 more minutes about this, and then I'll talk for a few minutes about Leibniz's version of the argument. I'll put a little bit on the whiteboard, and then we'll peace out. I started and I moved pretty quick through one step of the argument. One step of the argument is that, well, there are causal chains, and of course they have to have a beginning. That's not entirely obvious. So there are causal chains, and everyone should admit that. But once you admit that, you don't have to admit that they have beginnings, right? So there are 3 basic options, right? You could have, so we know that there are causal chains. Let the arrows represent a causality relation. A causing B causing C. We know that that exists. But once you know that that exists, you got 3 options for understanding the structure of those causal chains. It may be that A causes B causes C, but A is uncaused. That causal chains do come to an end. But it may also be that never happens. Yeah, A causes B causes C, but something else causes A, and it just goes on infinitely. The causal chain goes infinitely into the past. It never started. Finally, so on the second option, this is their first cause option. You call this an infinite regress, right? Because the causal chain goes infinitely backwards. You don't have to commit on this option to it going infinitely forwards, but you do have to commit to it going infinitely into the past. And for that reason, time would have to be infinitely long, because causes and effects take time, right? So if there's infinitely many causes going back from now, you have infinite amount of time. And finally, you could say that A causes B, which causes C, but maybe causal chains are circular. So they don't have a beginning, but they're also not infinitely long. Or let me say this, there aren't infinitely many causes going backwards in time. I do think time would still have to be infinitely long, but there aren't infinitely many causes. In this causal chain, there's only 3. Here, in this second one, there's infinitely many, right? That's what the ... represents. It goes back forever. But here, you've only got 3. A causes B causes C, and C causes A. But this is a crazy view, this third view. I call this cyclical causation. It's a crazy view for this reason. Nothing can cause itself. But of course, if A causes B, which causes C, which causes A, then A ultimately is causing itself, right? So you have, this is essentially like saying that, you know, domino 1 knocks down domino 2, which knocks down domino 3. Well, what knocked down domino 1? Oh, domino 3. Well, wait a second. Now you ultimately have domino 1 starting the chain which knocks itself down. How could that happen? Because nothing can happen before itself, right? But what you're saying here is that, well, domino 1 was knocked down before domino 1 was knocked down. And that's crazy. That's absurd, right? So to state this generally, causal chains cannot be circular because it would require an event occurring before itself, right? But no event occurs before itself. It occurs simultaneously with itself. That's what it means to be the same one and the same event. Okay, man, we're getting crazy here. So this seems like a bad option. I think the infinite regress option seems kind of absurd. But this is where the argument really happens right here. This is where it happens. A lot of philosophers who are proponents of the first cause argument argue that this is an absurd option as well, just as absurd as this cyclical causation argument. And if they can establish that, then they've got their argument. There has to have been a first cause. And then they just have to argue about what that first cause would have to be like. And they'll say, well, it would have to be a necessary being or something like that. It would have to be outside of the universe. It would have to be outside of the causal order, something like that. But if they can get this first step, that's a big step. So it really all depends. If we assume that cyclical causation is bad news bears, then it really depends on whether we can establish that the infinite regress option is absurd as well. And so philosophers will say things like this. Well, it's basically like imagining that the domino chain just is infinitely long, right? It never started. Dominoes have fallen, but they never started falling. They've always been falling, right? So yeah, this is the last domino. It fell. Well, what caused it? Well, another domino falling. What caused that? Another domino falling. And it just keeps going on like that. There's no end to it. There's no beginning, to that causal chain. It just goes infinitely into the past. And philosophers will say, this is the notion of an actual infinite. And the notion of an actual infinite is an absurd notion. So we have notions of infinity. You might have talked about it in calculus or some other branch of math, where we learn that the number of integers, for example, is infinite. We learn that the number of real numbers is infinite. There's also crazy proofs you can do in math to show that some orders of infinity are larger. Some infinities are larger than other infinities, which is insane. So I did one of those proofs in a logic class once. I don't remember how it worked. But apparently some infinities are bigger than other infinities. Regardless, we have this notion of infinity in mathematics. But what philosophers who are proponents of this first cause argument say is that this is a notion of a potential infinity. It's not a notion of a concrete infinite number of things, right? It's abstract, for example. Numbers are abstractions. But you could never have an actual infinite amount of things in the world, or at least concrete things. So imagine William Lane Craig is a philosopher who's a proponent of this. It's actually a version of the causal argument called the Kalam argument. It goes back to, I think, medieval Muslim philosophers. And he says, imagine, let's try to work out the absurdity of an actual infinite. Imagine that you have a book, a library, or a shelf of books that has an infinite number of books on it, and they alternate red, green, red, green, red, green. Well, now imagine that you pull out all the red books. Well, now you've still got the same number of books, right? So this is a weird view. It makes sense in abstracta, in terms of abstract numbers, that we could have infinites, but in terms of concrete causes or things in the causal order, it's absurd to think that there could be an actual infinite. Now, it's unclear whether that argument works, but that's the argument, and it's intended to establish that the causal chains could not go infinitely backwards. They had to have a beginning. And like I said, if you get that, then you've established that there's a first cause. Now you could, talk about at that point whether that's enough to establish anything towards God existing. But that's a big conclusion, right? Because if there's a first cause, that's really one of the big premises of the argument. We could, if you really are interested, we can really work this out in valid premise conclusion form. It goes something like this. Let's actually rework that. If there are causal chains, then there was a first cause. There obviously are causal chains. Therefore, there was a first cause. And again, you can talk here about whether this is enough to do anything to establish that God exists. Some people will just say, and this is mentioned in your text, yeah, there was a first cause and it was just the Big Bang. But proponents of the first cause argument will say that's not good enough, right? That is an event in the causal order. It's a contingent event and it needs a causal explanation. But a necessary being does not need a causal explanation. So that's a good stopping point. So the real question here, and I'll end on this before we go on to talk a little bit about Leibniz. The real question here is, if you admit that there's a first cause in any causal chain, what's a good kind of stopping point, right? Is a domino falling a good stopping point? Can it just happen without a cause? You'd like to say, no, that's not a good stopping point. Well, what about Justin knocking over the domino? Well, ultimately, no, right? Because it's not a good stopping point. Something has to have caused me to knock over that. Maybe it's my belief that I should knock it over, that I need a good illustration to start this lecture off. But what caused that belief? And again, we can keep going, right? None of these things, because they're contingent, they could have easily failed to occur, is a good explanation or a good stopping point, a good candidate, an eligible bachelor for the first cause, right? What would be a good candidate would be a necessary being, a being that could not have failed to exist, that must exist. And that proponents of this argument will say God. Let's talk real quick about Leibniz's argument. One failing of the first cause argument, like I just said, is that it's not totally clear that the universe could not have existed forever. So it's not totally clear that causal chains have to have a beginning, right? So that was the second option we outlined on the whiteboard. But Leibniz says, even if that's right, he has a version of the first cause argument that says, even if that's right, we still have to explain the existence of the universe, not the start of the existence of it, but why it exists at all. So maybe it's always existed, but you can still ask of something that has always existed why it exists, especially if it's contingent. And it seems, Leibniz says, that even a universe that has always existed might not have ever existed, right? It still could be contingent, right? So imagine, it's hard because, right, we don't know of anything that has literally always existed, unless possibly the universe, I don't know. But you can ask of something that has always existed why it exists, right? And that seems like a good question, right? It doesn't seem like, well, it's always existed. We don't have to give an explanation for why it exists, because your explanations are not always requests for what brought it into existence, right? Nothing brought the universe into existence if it's always existed, but that's not exactly what we're asking for when we ask why it exists. It still seems like it's contingent. It could have failed to exist. And Leibniz says, okay, so even if the universe has always existed, we still need an explanation of its existence. And he says, why? Because, let me see if I can get this, there we go. Because he thinks that something like the following principle is true. He calls this the principle of sufficient reason. All contingent events or entities have an explanation. Now, if you think that this principle is right, you can pause right there if you want to look at this longer, but I'm going to move away from the whiteboard. This principle seems true. If something could have failed to happen, it must have an explanation. So imagine that you, again, let's say, look at a historical example. Why did Hitler invade Russia? He didn't have to. It's contingent, right? It could have failed to happen. What if you just said, well, there's no explanation for why he did that? You seem to be saying something kind of silly, right? There might not be any rational explanation. Maybe that's what we mean when we say that sometimes, but there's still an explanation, right? So even if the explanation is like some little weird thing fired off in his brain irrationally, or he's schizophrenic or whatever, there's still an explanation for why he acted as he did, right? Think about non-historical, non-intentional cases, right? Why did the avalanche happen? Right, so the snow fell off the mountain or whatever, killed some skiers or something, or whatever. Let's be happy and say it buried them and they got out. Whatever, a dog found them. It's a feel-good story. Why did it happen? It could have failed to happen. It didn't have to happen. So it seems like a fair question to ask why it happened. Now it might be that the explanation is beyond our knowledge. Like we can't. No one was there to see it. No one knows what caused it. But that's very, very different from saying that it has no explanation, right? We can say we don't know the explanation. We might even be able to say we'll never know, or we can't know the explanation. It's just categorically out of our reach. But that's very different from saying it has no explanation. There are lots of things we'll never know the explanation of, but that still have an explanation, right? So when I was growing up, I was super curious about the Marfa lights. Marfa, if you don't know it, is in West Texas, and it's kind of become hipsterville now, but back in the day, my family would take vacations out to West Texas and go to Fort Davis and Marfa and Big Bend and El Paso and all these places. And Marfa was kind of a sleepy-ish little town. There were some artists out there at that point, but not much was going on besides that. Except that there were these things called the Marfa lights. And it was one of those things kind of like... what's the thing in Scotland called? The Loch Ness Monster that someone probably drummed up to get tourism and make money. But you would go out into the desert and, into some certain spot, and you'd look off into the distance and it would get dark and you'd see some lights. And nobody knew what they were, right? Now, maybe somebody knows what they are and they're keeping it quiet, or like maybe there's actually, I haven't done a ton of research on this, right? I think at some point I heard that it was like the reflection of lights on the highway or something like this, car lights, that is. But you might imagine that there's something like that. Maybe I don't know, assume just for the sake of argument, we don't know what the explanation of the Marfa lights is. That's very different from saying there is no explanation. Right? I remember when I was little thinking, you know what, the first thing I'm going to ask God when I die, I'm going to ask him, what are the Marfa lights? So just an explanation being off limits to us, or us not being able to understand it or access it, doesn't mean that it's not there. And so, of course, in that sense, once you get clear on that, forget about the question of whether we can know the explanation. All contingent events have an explanation. There is something that explains why the Marfa lights happen. We don't know, maybe we don't know what it is, but something explains it. Okay, so that's the principle of sufficient reason. All contingent events or entities, that is beings, have an explanation. Notice that it's just about contingent events and entities. Leibniz thinks that a necessary being or a necessary event or fact might not have an explanation, or maybe it explains itself or something. I don't know. But It's open. He's not saying that all events and entities have an explanation. This leaves open that necessary beings might not be explained. They don't need to be explained. They couldn't have failed to exist, right? Anyway, so wrapping up, Leibniz goes on to say it's really quick and easy from here. The universe, even if it has always existed, is contingent. And so the universe needs an explanation if the principle of sufficient reason is true. What could the explanation of the universe be? Well, the universe, as we're defining it, is just all physical things that exist. So what that means is if the universe itself has an explanation, assuming that things can't explain themselves, or parts of things can't explain the thing, what that means is nothing within the universe, or even the universe itself, could explain the existence of the universe, even if it's always existed. And what that means, if we define the universe as all physical existence, is something non-physical to explain the universe. And something, in fact, outside the causal order, outside of the causes and effects, right? And Leibniz is just going to say that thing, we know that it has to be necessary, because otherwise it would also require an explanation, and we'd have to go on this infinite chain. So we know that this non-physical necessary being has to exist to explain the existence of the universe, if you accept the principle of sufficient reason, which it seems like a very plausible principle. So that's Leibniz's first cause argument. God must exist to explain the existence of a contingent, even if necessary, or even if always existing universe. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave you all with that. I'll say this, I'll just mention some objections real quick so you can think about them. Some people have questioned the sufficient reason. You can think about that. I'm not going to go into it. Some people, again, as always, question whether knowing that a necessary non-physical thing caused the universe, explains the universe, is far enough towards us, is enough to show that God exists. And again, it doesn't by itself, right? It doesn't show that there's only one God. It doesn't show that this thing would have to be all powerful or all knowing or all good. It doesn't show that this thing still exists. It just shows that it had to have existed at one point. Although this is a weird argument, because I think you can establish, if this is right, that this being would have to exist outside time. So there's no talk, you can't really talk about it stopping existing, right? Because the universe, right, includes the temporal order too, the existence of time and events causing each other. And if you know that the cause of the universe has to be outside the universe, you know that it has to be outside time, plausibly. But even still, you don't get the conclusion that God exists out of this argument. But like I've been hammering on about, it goes a pretty good way towards establishing it. Like, you're an atheist and you accept all of the premises of this argument, and therefore you accept the conclusion, you should be really, really uncomfortable right now. Atheists should not want to admit that there are necessary non-physical beings outside of the existence of the universe and the causal order. They'd have to be supernatural, right? Atheists, if I'm right, do not want to admit that there are supernatural beings that necessarily exist, regardless of whether they're God or not. Okay, so we'll end there, and I'll talk to y'all soon.